Okay, so we're a couple of minutes past the hour. I just want to welcome everybody to the Seasteading Social. We do this on a monthly basis in which we invite some foremost thought leaders in the realms of seasteading and plus an additional topic. And for World Ocean Day, we have some incredible speakers here presenting about their various initiatives. Just full disclosure, this is different than most of our normal seasteading socials. We are actually recording this because we have some incredible speakers and we wanted to capture this beautiful moment in some kind of way to share with the broader community for those who couldn't attend. So if you are uncomfortable with showing your face on camera or anything like that, this is Zoom, and so you can just turn off your video. Make sure that I just wanted to kind of disclose that recording to everybody before we really launch into our overall discussion. And today is World Ocean Day. And so a lot of what we'll be talking about, and what I'm very excited to talk about, is different things, World Water Day, sorry. We'll be talking about different sort of approaches towards promoting more environmental policy as it relates to free market economics, as it relates to setting up economic systems and establishing special economic zones, going about using seasteadings as a force for positive impact on the climate and climate change. I am Elliot Roth. I am an avid seasteading supporter. I've been a seasteading ambassador since 2013. I run a company that grows algae as a carbon negative replacement for various materials. And I'm deeply excited and honored to be kind of moderating the discussion between the speakers today. And so we have three phenomenal speakers, and I am going to introduce the first one shortly, but just to give you a brief overview, we have Holly Fretwell here from PERC, Gregory DeLon, did I pronounce your last name right? And Gregory DeLon, who's been founder and CEO of a number of different things, but Deep Blue Institute is predominantly what I think he'll be talking about today. And then we have Paul Gamble here, who's the CEO and co-founder of Nori, which is a carbon removal marketplace. And so, so very excited to first introduce Holly Fretwell. Holly is the Vice President of Outreach and a Research Fellow at PERC. And PERC, let's see if I get the Propane Education and Research Council, is that correct? No, I'm joking.
No, we're the Property and Environment Research Center, and we will talk a lot more about that.
Jokes. So you talk a lot about land policy, property rights, markets, free market economics. Really wonderful. You are located in Montana currently, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. You're also a published author, which is incredible. You have written a number of different papers on free market environmentalism, have given congressional testimony on U.S. national parks, future of the Forest Service. I'm assuming you have a lot of ideas and interest in ocean-based parks as well, which is really interesting and something we could potentially talk about. And then you've also taught economics previously. You hold a bachelor's degree in political science, a master's degree in resource economics, and are an avid environmentalist. And so I'm very excited to introduce Holly to talk a little bit about your work and introduce kind of different sort of ideas that can kick off this discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Elliot. I'm gonna share my screen. I have a couple of simple slides. All right, can you all see that? Super. Well, again, thanks, Elliot and Seastead Institute for inviting me. This is I think it's gonna be a great discussion. I'm really excited to be a part of it. And I have to admit that I was a little surprised when you all called on me to be part of the World Water Day discussion with a couple of other great speakers, Paul and Greg, who are really knee deep in issues on both oceans and carbon. And at PERC, we don't really focus specifically on ocean. We don't do a lot of focus on carbon, but what we do is really think about what we call free market environmentalism. And free market environmentalism environmentalism should be part of any environmentalism conversation, because it's a different way of thinking about issues and ideas, and a way that will really help us focus on what some of the environmental problems are, why we have them, and how we can sort of resolve some of those problems. As you can see from my first slide here, we are located in beautiful Bozeman, Montana. We're about 700 miles away from the nearest ocean. And again, as an organization, we don't really focus on ocean issues. We certainly have looked at fisheries, we've looked at parks, particularly on lands, but have also thought about them on waters as well. We do a lot of on-the-ground work on wildlife, on land. We played a pretty important role in integrating water markets into the Western United States over the past couple of decades. And again, what I really want to talk about here, though, rather than the specific projects that we've worked on, is really about free market environmentalism, what we call FME. That's the backbone of who we are and what we do. So I want to sort of provide a framework for how to help think about environmental issues and the potential solutions to some of these environmental problems that we're dealing with across the globe. So we're going to think about how and when markets work, why they work, opportunities for resolution when they're not working. Because as you see with free market environmentalism, we have a really big focus on markets. So I'm going to give you just a couple of key tenets that we think about. And one is that environmental issues are the result of competing demands for scarce resources. And I'm going to give you a few examples to help you think about this. So think about flowing river water. We have this flowing water in a river, and there's all these different uses that people want from that river water. We can think about it for drinking water. We can think about it for irrigation, as you see in the background here. This is actually the Madison River here in Montana. You can think about the fish habitat that exists there, the recreation that people want, just the wetlands and what that's providing for our environment, all these different uses. So how do we decide how best to allocate that water use? How do we decide who gets how much? How do we decide what the best use of that water is? And the type of allocation system is going to help us determine the efficiency and what those conservation outcomes are. We could think of ocean fisheries, right? Who gets to catch and sell the fish? We have this competing demand for this resource, the fish in the ocean and all those other resources that the ocean's providing for us. Who gets to decide how we use that? Who gets to decide how many fish stay in the ocean? Who gets to decide what is a sustainable population? And how do we go about preventing overharvest and collapsing fisheries? And we have seen fisheries collapse on a massive scale across the globe. So how do we help allocate those resources so we get better outcomes, so we get more sustainable outcomes? And of course, we can think about air. Do we all have a right to clean air? How do we decide who gets to use the air? How clean is clean enough in our air? Who's allowed to emit particulate matter and pollutants and carbon? How do we decide who gets to pollute those and how much they get to emit out there? And all these different competing demands require some form of allocation system. And we could think about different systems. Maybe we just give it to the richest and best known people. Maybe we allow the ones who have the greatest willingness to pay get to use these resources. Maybe government gets to decide and just allocate who gets these resources. Or perhaps we just ration them. Everybody gets an equal percent, or it's a first come, first serve, and we queue everybody up in line. How we use these resources is going to depend upon what that allocation system is and what incentives are being driven from that particular type of allocation system. So free market environmentalism really focuses on using an allocation system that gets the incentives right to encourage prosperity and environmental quality by providing timely and relevant information and allowing trade. Free market environmentalism looks at how people are motivated by the different allocation systems and tries to help align behavior with environmental quality and good conservation outcomes. And in fact, when we look at the immense information that comes from our markets, we find these market transactions provide us with information about societal demands, scarcity, all sorts of issues that one individual doesn't have that information on, but overall that aggregate information is being provided for in the marketplace. And those incentives are driven by what we call institutions as economists, or it's a good rule of law. And we can think of all sorts of different types of these institutions or these rules of law that actually impact our behavior, that impact the incentives that we have. And we can think about incentives as those rewards and punishments that are actually motivating our behavior. And those incentives comes from the form of governance, the rules and regulations we have, the property rights that exist out there, our customs, our norms, our traditions, our religion, anything and everything that's pushing us to behave in one way instead of another way fits under this idea of what we call institutions. And when we can look at the good rule of law, we think about how governance is helping form those institutions for us. And one of the key components that we focus on at PERC are clear property rights, because clear property rights are a key to well-functioning markets. If we don't have clear property rights, our markets may not function well. And we can think of property rights, and oftentimes teachers will talk about a bundle of sticks. There's a bundle of sticks, and each stick provides either a right of something you can do with your property or your resource or your asset, or maybe it has a restriction, things that you can't do with your property, and restricting you from doing those things. And there's some infinite number of sticks that exist out there. But there are 5 key characteristics that we can think about that really motivate how we use property and resources, and sort of pulls these pieces together for us to think about, how do people behave when they have clear property rights? How do they behave when they don't have clear property rights? And how can we, again, align individual behavior to come up with really good environmental outcomes? And so these 5 key characteristics starts with being defined. Do you know what you own, that resource? You can define it, other people accept that you have that property right. We know where your property boundaries are. If you're looking at a piece of land, we know that's your vehicle if you're driving a car. But then it's also important that you have defendability on that right, that you can defend that right. It really is yours. Other people agree that it's yours. We have some enforceability, and that we can exclude others from it, right? So if I want to save some of my fish in the ocean, someone else can't come in and just catch them. I can exclude others from taking my fish. And on the land, that's much easier. I can exclude others from coming onto my land and coming and stealing my tomatoes or my zucchinis, what I'm growing in my garden. But when we're talking about the oceans, fish swim. And so that's a much more difficult idea for us to think about. How do we actually provide for that excludability? But it's really important, because otherwise we come up with what we call the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons occurs when there's not excludability over some scarce resource use. And if there's no excludability, people rush to claim the resource before somebody else gets it. Sometimes we call it the race to fish, right? Fishermen go out there, they catch as many fish as they can, because anyone that conserves those fish and leaves those fish in the ocean is not going to have the ability to catch those fish later, because somebody else will come catch those fish. So the tragedy of the commons results in some overuse of that resource. And again, we see those collapsing fisheries that we have in today's world. It's also really important that our property is tradable, it's appropriable. And the reason that this is so key is because it motivates cooperation amongst individuals and consideration of how people value different resources. So I'm going to give you an example thinking about water rights in the Western United States. Our water rights are based on prior appropriations doctrine, and they give the first water claimant to the right the full use to that. If we go back into the late 1700s, early 1800s, the first individual that pulled water out of that river has the right to use that river or that creek, has the right to use that water, full use, however much they used. The next person that comes has the right to what's left. The third person that comes has the right to what's left after that, and so forth over time. And historically, these rights were use it or lose it. That's, let's say I'm what we call the senior rights holder. I'm the first one that came and got pulled water out of the river. So I'm using it. I have that water right. If I don't use it, I lose it. I don't get it anymore. Somebody else gets it. One of those more junior rights holders, as we call them, will actually get that water right, and I don't get it back. So the motivation for me, the incentive for me, is to continue to use that full water claim, regardless of what I'm using it on, to make sure that I'm using that water claim. And historically, it required what we called beneficial use. Historically, that was withdrawal. You had to pull the water out of the stream or the riverbed for irrigation, for mining, for drinking water, etc. But it actually had to be pulled out of the water or out of the river. Any water left in stream was considered non-use. And finally, it was non-tradable. You couldn't sell your right to someone else to use that water. You had to use your right, you had to use your full right, and you had to pull that water out of stream to use it. So senior holders, and even though those early junior holders really had no reason to pay attention to low water flows, or even the later people, because you had to use that water, you'd lose the right. So what we actually see over time is we have dry waterbeds, we have dry rivers, we have fish kills, because we continue to pull more and more water out of that river. We're over allocating the water that's in there in low water years. And as a result, we don't have any habitat left for our fish. We don't have any water left for recreationists. And again, this is all based on the incentives that were created under this water law, because we weren't allowed to trade water. Go into about the 1970s, and states began to change the water law. We started to allow in-stream flow. We defined in-stream flow as a beneficial use. And importantly, we allowed for trade. Trade became legal for water. That entirely changed the incentives under this new law, because it encouraged farmers, it encouraged fishers, it encouraged recreationists to cooperate, to try to find what the highest valued use of that water was. Maybe it wasn't for irrigation anymore. Maybe it actually was for fish habitat. And now we could actually get groups together to work with and cooperate with some of these farmers and these ranchers to leave that water in stream, not losing their right, but instead getting paid because there's another alternative use that's really important and really valuable. And we saw groups like Trout Unlimited begin to pay farmers to stop or reduce the irrigation, to leave water in stream, especially again in those low flow years. So just changing that one characteristic here, that appropriability, entirely changed how we look at our water flow in the West. And finally, people need to be liable for their property. That is, property and resource owners must be responsible for resource use and any damage done to other individuals. Say, I don't have the right to dump waste onto my neighbor or onto you, or to pollute my neighbor's land. And I will be held liable if I do so. And generally speaking, in the United States, that is enforced by our common law. So to come back to the ideas of just our basic tenets, markets use decentralized information. It's this decentralized information that flows from individual decisions, and it relies on entrepreneurs. And this is the allocation system of using markets. The alternative, or one extreme alternative to this, is the command and control system, right? Where we have some governance that decides how we're going to allocate our resources, who gets to use them, and how they get to use them. At PERC, we call that political environmentalism, and it provides very different incentives to those individuals. When we think about our markets, they're very dynamic. They continually aggregate individual information, which is constantly changing, and they provide that information out there to individuals in the marketplace in a way that regulations and legislation really can't. So to sum up just sort of these basic ideas of free market environmentalism, as we think about environmental issues, both here today and in the future, think about, are property rights secure? If there are demanders of resources and demanders of resources, and owners can negotiate in these cooperative agreements, then we can achieve these desired end results in a win-win way. We're cooperating with each other, we have win-win solutions. If we're not able to do that, if the market's not getting us there, what's missing, right? And what is the lowest cost way to better define those rights? Is it possible to better define those rights? When we think about some of the things that are happening in the ocean and the air, that's much more difficult. These are property rights issues. These are property rights problems, but it becomes more difficult sometimes to define those rights and who actually has the use of those rights, so who has the ability to trade those rights. When we look at issues in the developed world, we've solved a lot of the easy problems already, right? We've solved some of those lower hanging fruit problems, but nonetheless, there's a lot more that we can do to think about ground up solutions, increasing this cooperation and decreasing the conflict that oftentimes results from political environmentalism. And that political environmentalism, governance and politicians get to pick those winners and those losers. And generally we end up in what we call a zero-sum game, or a winner takes all type game. We also have a really long way to go to help people in the developing world and help them gain access to secure property rights. Not only are property rights key for motivating environmental quality and conservation, but they're also key to prosperity. Property rights and markets motivate innovation and entrepreneurship, and they provide leverage for needed capital. So if we want to resolve global environmental issues, we need to start at the root. We need to encourage cooperative, win-win, voluntary solutions, and that begins with markets and property rights. And I will leave it there. And I'm happy to take
Awesome.
any questions.
Thank you so much, Holly. That was an astounding overview, really good way to kick off this entire discussion. I think one of the key questions that I had, and that I think a couple of our audience tended to have, is what happens if there's a resource like fish, as an example, that's more migratory or is in your coastal waters in some instances, and then not in your coastal waters. I'm thinking migratory patterns of salmon or other such fish. And so what happens then when that resource, the ownership over that resource, changes depending on the season, depending on migratory patterns?
Right, and that's an excellent question, and it's a really difficult one, right? When we think about things that are moving, one of the ways that we've dealt with fisheries when we're talking about fisheries within our coastal waters is looking at tradable quotas or catch shares, they're sometimes called. And essentially what that is we've allowed individuals that are fishing at the time, we've sort of given them some historic right and said, okay, instead of just restricting your season, which is what we historically did, we just kept saying, okay, if we're talking about the halibut fishery, for example, up in Alaska, we felt like we were overfishing that fishery, and there were fewer and fewer fish, and that population was collapsing. And each year the government came in and said, oh, we can't catch as many fish, so we're going to shorten the season. We're going to shorten the season. We're going to shorten the season. And pretty soon we had 2 days to fish for fresh halibut for the commercial fishermen. And we were catching more fish. You think, well, how could that possibly be, right? How can we catch more fish in a shorter and shorter period of time? We went from more than 6 months to 2 days. And that's because we invest in more capital. We have bigger boats, we have bigger nets, we have better nets, we have better equipment. When we're tangling up with our neighbor fishers, we're just cutting those nets. We're not worried about the fish left in the ocean. We're just trying to make sure that in this 2-day period, we can get our catch and we can bring it to shore. So that solution wasn't working. That was a very political environmentalism solution. How can we better create some sort of property right on that? And one of the solutions that's come out of that is the tradable quotas, or oftentimes called rations or catch shares. And essentially what we've done there is we've measured the population of fish in the ocean of certain types of fisheries and said, well, here's the number of fish that exist out there, something like this. And we have to keep this many in the ocean for a sustainable population of fish. So that means that this difference up here, we can actually catch and continue that sustainable population. And hopefully we've measured this in a way that we can see increasing populations if we're seeing these declining populations. And that amount we're allowed to catch is called the total allowable catch, or the TAC. Mm-hmm. And we've divided that up amongst the different fishers in that commercial fishery and given them each a % of that TAC. And therefore, as we see increasing fish populations, they actually get to catch more fish. They still have the same %, but they get to catch more fish. And in that way, we've created a property right. And you can think about this really is a cap and trade solution. So governance came in and said, okay, we're going to give you some cap. This is the max amount you can catch. And then we're going to allow you to figure out within the marketplace how to trade that around. And the rations or the catch shares are tradable. That is, if I'm out there fishing and I want to get out of the fishery, or somebody else wants to get in, I can sell that. Certainly not a perfect solution by any means, but it certainly has helped us increase those fish populations. It has helped enhance good environmental outcomes, even though that income distribution, we could argue about whether that's the right type of income distribution. So thinking about that is one way for us to try to move forward and think about how do we manage for some of these things and creating property rights on it. We have new technologies. We can follow whales. The hardest part here, and I don't have a solution for this, is how do you get into treaties with other countries to ensure that we're abiding by those property rights, or that we're agreeing on who has the property rights, so that we actually can see this type of negotiation and cooperation take place.
Yeah, I guess the other question that kind of sparks discussion is also, as climate change opens up new waterways in particular, I'm thinking in the Arctic or the creation of like islands in the South China Sea, how do the kind of creation of these new waterways, how does that lead to a tradable routes, a kind of segmentation, and because this new property, new growing season, new ability has been created, who determines who gets ownership of those areas? How do they get ownership? And then is there a current international court of law? How is that decided right now outside of might makes right?
Right, and I don't have any great answers to that one at all. Again, from a free market environmentalism perspective, what we really want to see is those property rights being defined. And if you look at it, for those that have studied economics, if you look at the Coase theorem, once we have clear property rights, it really shouldn't matter who owns it. Then we can allow for that cooperative exchange. Again, income distribution is going to change tremendously. Customs and norms are going to impact how this is used. But we can imagine, even if we could define, some whaling group that is actually going out and killing whales, we could actually give them the property right to a whale, and then the rest of us could actually bid to buy that for them to not kill that whale. We can allow for that cooperative result. And if it really is a higher valued use to leave that whale in the ocean, then presumably there's a lot of us that are willing to pay for that, right? Now, again, not perfect solutions. There's not perfect information. And we also have what we call free riders out there. But my guess is there's a lot of us that are willing to ante up or pony up to pay for some of this stuff. And we don't need everybody to do it. We can have free riders as long as there's enough people willing to sort of make that statement of this is the biggest societal concern. And we are therefore willing to pay for that so that whale stays in the ocean instead of being killed and pulled out and used for other things.
Great answers. Thank you so much, Holly. We're gonna probably have additional discussion as Greg and Paul kind of weigh in on different facets of environmentalism, economics, and promoting really virtuous cycles kind of like that. And so that's actually a really good transitional point to introduce Greg, who's our next speaker. Moving things right along. Greg is an internationally recognized consultant. He is really an advocate for public-private partnerships, green, clean, smart cities, sustainable economic development, special economic zones. He is the co-founder and CEO of the Urban Innovation Exchange, and then also of the New Orleans-based Deep Blue Institute, of which I think he's going to be mainly talking about now, and scaling kind of regenerative marine infrastructure, blue economy solutions. He's one of the founding members of Blue Frontiers and has a deep background in economics, urban design, regional planning policy, and has done these sort of things in all sorts of different emerging economies. And so I'm deeply excited and honored, humbled that Greg has taken some time today to talk a little bit about some of the work that he's doing and how it relates to seasteading and environmentalism. So Greg, take us away. I think you're on mute.
All right, is that better?
Better, much better, thank you.
All right, can y'all see my screen? You can see my screen?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you very much, Elliot. Thank you, Carly and Joe and the Seasteading Institute. It's great to be back with you, see some familiar faces and lots of new faces, which is exciting. Holly's presentation was really a good contextualization of what I'm going to be talking about in terms of economic issues and the real politique, if you will, of how we need to move forward with many of the technologies and the movements that we talk about in the seasteading community. So I'm going to be talking about a concept called Nouveau-Né Parish, or newborn parish, on the Blue Tech Delta, and how local, regional, and global strategies for growing the blue economy can start to manifest in the Louisiana estuary, which is basically southern Louisiana and the Mississippi Delta, but also really all of the Gulf Coast as an area that's on the front lines of climate change and sea level rise. And the focus of the Deep Blue Institute is on regenerative marine infrastructure. So I'll be talking a little bit about what that means and how we're promoting that idea and how it relates to disaster risk reduction, which is a United Nations concept, marine habitat restoration, and cultural preservation for Louisiana, but also other parts of the world. So a bit of my background, Elliot mentioned I come from architecture, urban design, and economic development. I've worked in economic development, sustainable economic development projects all over the world, particularly in Latin America and Europe, trying to balance the three-legged stool of environmental issues, traditional economic issues, and cultural and social preservation issues. So that my public-private partnership work on that type of economic development and my smart cities work was one of the reasons that I was asked to join the Seasteading Institute team, which went to French Polynesia in 2016 to pitch the president and his cabinet on the concept of French Polynesia being a leader in the global community for developing seasteading technologies. So out of that, I got to know the folks at Blue 21, which designed this amazing prototype floating community for the lagoons or atolls of French Polynesia. And out of that, we formed the startup Blue Frontiers, which was the for-profit companion to the nonprofit Seasteading Institute to promote this idea of floating communities in French Polynesia. So since then, I have created a new focus with Deep Blue Institute, which is focused on Louisiana and the economy. And this is a little shot of Mardi Gras 2021 versus Mardi Gras 2020. I happened to speak on a panel on the Saturday before Mardi Gras this year and got to show this. And it really underscores the fact that for Louisiana, which is fundamentally the economy's base is focused on tourism and petrochemical industry, that there really needs to be a new solution, a new way forward, because the impacts of COVID and on the Louisiana economy and the region have been really, really hard. And in fact, New Orleans is expected to be one of the 5 cities most impacted by COVID. So there's a critical need for adaptation of the economy in Louisiana, but also a unique potential because of the frontline nature of where we are, potential for leadership and success. So diversifying away from petrochemical and tourism is important, and tapping into the already $3.4 billion global marine technology market, which is expected to continue to grow at a very fast rate of 10 to 12% annually, is projected to be as much as $6.5 billion by 2024. So lots of potential there. And then realizing that globally 3 billion people depend on marine and coastal areas for their livelihood. So this is a very important and expanding part of economies around the world, particularly in countries like France and for areas like Louisiana. And Louisiana really is on the front lines of this. Louisiana is losing a football field of land every hour and a half. So in about the little over the time that will be on this this Zoom call, Louisiana will lose another football field of land. And even under medium scenarios, we're looking at over 2,250 square miles of land loss in the next 50 years. And all of these red areas are places where people live and do various types of marine-related work, such as shrimping and fishing and oyster farming, as well as a lot of sport fishing and recreational activities, which Louisiana is known for. So we all heard about Katrina and the impacts of Katrina. And in fact, in 2005, just 3 weeks after Katrina, Rita also hit the area and re-flooded a lot of the areas and exacerbated the damage of Katrina. And this is really the new reality that coastal areas and low-lying communities, particularly in delta regions, are facing, and what we need to be planning for. Globally, many of you may know that approximately 10% of the population, or over 600 million people, live in less than 10 meters above sea level, and close to 40%, or 2.4 billion people, live within 100 kilometers of the coast. So fundamentally, this is a human existential problem that we need to be solving. And we saw that 2020 tied 2016 as the warmest year on record. But instead of thinking that 2020 was perhaps the warmest year over the last 100 or 125 years, we should really be thinking about what if 2020 is the coolest year for the next 100 years, and contemplate what that may mean for all the changes that are happening along in coastal areas. So these are some of the existing conditions and global challenges that are really causing the need or triggering the need for adaptation. And I say adaptation because I would say we're basically beyond mediation or prevention for many of these things. So we're already losing coastal communities with all of their cultural heritage. The land loss in particularly low-lying areas is being exacerbated by subsidence, the storm surges and king tides that are associated with storm activities. And then also in rivers around the world, including the Nile and the Mississippi and the Ganges and areas around the world, that the sediment cycles have been interrupted because of dams, et cetera, et cetera. So that's contributing to subsidence. We have nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, which is destroying inland lakes and rivers, but also on the in the Gulf area, we have the second largest harmful algae bloom or dead zone in the world, and that's one of over 105 harmful algae blooms around the world. So in 2019, there was estimated to be close to 8,000 square miles. That's equivalent to the combined area of Rhode Island and Connecticut. And with that goes tremendous loss of seafood and other sorts of livelihood for communities. So this has real economic losses to some of what Holly was talking about. It's estimated by NOAA that the US loses $82 million a year in seafood and tourism from these harmful algae blooms. And some statistics from Florida in 2018, 2016, 2007, 2005, millions and millions of dollars in environmental damage, in loss to aquaculture and mariculture, loss to the tourism industry in the form of restaurants and hotels, and then also real human issues in terms of health issues for people that are exposed to harmful algae blooms. So the UN is focused on its sustainable development goals, and the one that's particularly relevant to what we're talking about today is number 14, living below water, and it's focused on the goal to conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development, realizing that coastal and marine resources contributed $3 to $6 trillion a year to the global economy annually. So this is already a tremendous opportunity, and we're only seeing growth in this area. And the general idea being that with the blue economy, we can expand opportunities, but also help communities that are at risk in these areas. And that touches on another idea that the UN is promoting, the idea of a disaster risk reduction, realizing that there is no such thing as a natural disaster, there's just natural hazards. And those are increasing with climate change and with sea level rise. So, and it touches on all sorts of issues related to investment, education, awareness, planning, community participation, local knowledge about ocean and the economy, risk assessments, coordination, good governments, warning systems for these disasters and risks, sustainable development, and contingency plans for, again, adaptation. What are we going to do to deal with these things? So focusing a little bit on the Louisiana estuary, this presents some real opportunities. So some of these initiatives are already happening. There's a $50 billion in investment that is already starting to be utilized for projects along the Mississippi River and the Delta. And these touch on projects for improving water quality, tremendous opportunity for economic diversification with these sorts of blue technologies, ocean-based technologies, distributed renewable energy. There's, with the new administration, it's very much curtailing the potential for new oil drilling. But the good news is that there's a lot of new investment in new projects for offshore wind in the Gulf, and the Gulf is very favorable for offshore wind. Aquaculture, which is the fastest growing food sector in the world. So that's something that particularly for our bayous and near coastal areas here can be really important, and for the seafood industry on which Louisiana depends. And then also projects related to the sediment cycle restoration. So there's projects discussed to open up the levees and to change the course of the Mississippi, which will have a lot of community impacts and environmental impacts, but fundamentally it's to try to reverse the land loss that has been going on in Louisiana for such a long time. So in 2020, the Middlebury Institute coined the idea of a blue New Deal, which was in reaction to the Green New Deal. So there was a lot of momentum being built behind the Green New Deal. And basically the Blue New Deal is to look at what are these economic opportunities that we can look at for coastal adaptation and financing, for clean ocean energy, related to ports, shipping, and the maritime sector in general, and then sustainable fisheries, aquaculture, and marine biodiversity conservation. All these things that are not just good for the ocean, but also represent real economic opportunities for the communities that are involved. So fundamentally at Deep Blue Institute, what we're trying to do is bring this blue economy expertise bring together our different networks, including the Seasteading Institute, including Blue 21, our Dutch partner that we worked with in French Polynesia. Organizations like the Cleantech Open, which I'll mention a little bit later, is a early stage clean tech accelerator. Comate Resources is an organization we're working with locally. Buckminster Fuller, which is really a visionary organization that's focused on a lot of the ideas at a global scale in terms of how to save the planet, and bringing all these resources together to create a new narrative, if you will, of New Orleans and Louisiana as a nerve center and a point of interest and expertise for Louisiana. One of our key partners down here is Comate Resources. We're working on a proven technology for wastewater assimilation, wetlands that we want to expand to different parts of the coastal area to be used as buffer zones. So that's one of the real projects we're working on. And then also organizations like GNO Inc., which is focused on regional economic development for the area. So these are all organizations that we're connecting with and working with. This is the regional master plan that's already being implemented for Louisiana on all these different types of projects that we're connecting with. And all of this falls under what's called QIPRA, or the Coastal Wetlands Planning and Protection Act. That is the overarching policy for these areas. Pyramid Pure Foods is one of the organizations that we met through the Seasteading Institute. So we're working on some of these blue tech projects for combined integrated multi-trophic food, fuel, and freshwater production systems, and trying to get those prototyped in the area. And realizing that all of these mariculture and aquaculture systems really are already proven. It's just about scaling. I'm going to start moving pretty quickly here because I'm running slow on time. So a lot of this is references back to some of Joe Quirk's work in his book. And ultimately, we would want to be looking at in this Nouveau-Nez parish idea is to pair new floating communities with land-based communities and start to process with these new technologies of mariculture, hydroponics, pollution farming, and habitat restoration to be processing some of these land-based pollutants, et cetera, which are going to be more and more problematic as flooding starts to happen. So as these land-based infrastructure go offline, there's going to be the opportunity for the land-based community now underwater to learn from and benefit from the pollution harvesting technologies that the seasteading community and the blue economy can develop more quickly. So we want to come up with ideas to prototype and place these floating communities all over the Mississippi Delta as inundation starts to happen, and really rethink the entire system of what coastal cities look like and how land-based and marine-based communities can work together for the future. So I'll move quickly through some examples that Joe talks about, that these are not new ideas. Back in 1960, a floating community for Tokyo Bay was designed and verified by the US Navy as feasible. And the Seasteading Institute is promoting this idea of starting with first near land communities, and then slowly as the technologies develop, moving out until we can have completely independent communities and cities, even in international waters, where then we can also experiment with different governance techniques. All of these technologies fundamentally already exist, but are much too expensive right now for residential uses, but exist in the petroleum industry. And there's a lot of design out there already happening in terms of what floating communities and floating cities can look like. So that's fundamentally what we're drawing on in terms of feasibility for this. And then from there, we want to create these communities that will incorporate all of these different floating infrastructure that are engineered for storms, that are powered by all of these regenerative technologies, and Louisiana becomes a global center and expo area for these sorts of technologies that also in the process preserves bayou culture and festivals, et cetera. All of this while harvesting the runoff and pollution that's coming from inland. The Cleantech Open is one of our partners that we're working with. So we're starting to recruit early stage startup companies in clean tech and blue tech in Louisiana to begin this narrative of growing local talent and economic development in blue technology. And all then again, this is based on and built on the type of work that companies like Blue 21 is doing out of Rotterdam with already floating row houses and conference centers, et cetera, and the work that they did designing these regenerative communities for the floating communities for French Polynesia. And another example is in Miami, where the concept of salty urbanism is being used to plan for the future for areas that cannot be protected by seawalls, et cetera, that basically as inundation starts to happen, that we're using architecture and urban planning to plan for the future. So that's basically it. Again, some of our partners we're working with and hoping to bring to the table, and anybody who's interested in joining the team, please reach out to me. And ending with the idea of, if we're not doing this in places like Louisiana and frontline bayou communities, then where are we going to do it? And when are we going to get started? And if it's not those of us in Louisiana, and frankly, the folks that are on this call, then who's going to do it? And we really need to be doing it right now. So thank you very much. That's my email and our website for more information, and I'll be happy to answer some questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. So I have one question that's kind of in two parts. So if you had infinite money, really where money wasn't an object, where would you, and what would still be the barrier? What would still be the problem holding you up from accomplishing some of these goals? And then also, if you had infinite money, where would you spend it first?
Yeah, well, I had a wonderful call this morning, and working with Comey Resources here that I mentioned, we already have this wastewater assimilation wetland model, which is processing the sewage for Mandeville, which is on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, for a community of 100,000 people. Right now, they can quadruple that. They could take on a community of 400,000. So that's essentially using human waste to fertilize and grow biomass in wetland areas. So if we, and we're looking for the funding right now, and frankly, Elliot, the funding's out there. It's just a matter of speed of getting these models put in place along the coast. So with all of this, this black gold, this waste from land-based communities, with these existing technologies, we can fertilize and grow barrier islands, wetlands, marshes, bayous, all these areas. We can grow biomass and protect our coast and transition to that sort of an economy along the coast. And that's what's holding it back, is the distribution of capital and how fast we can build those projects.
So you're saying this is basically happening already. It's already going on. It's just how quickly it happens is the main thing.
It's like seasteading. All the technologies are proven. It's just how fast can we get them out there, and how fast can we incorporate them into new economic models, such as what Holly's talking about.
All right, fantastic. The future is already here. It's just not distributed yet.
Exactly.
So, all right, with that, I think I want to introduce our next speaker, somebody who's working on the very crux of the future, somebody who launched a cryptocurrency around environmentalism. And first, thank you to Greg for talking a lot about your initiatives. And now I'm going to shift over the discussion to introduce Paul Gamble, who's the CEO, co-founder of Nori, which is a carbon removal marketplace. And so Paul has been involved in carbon removal for a long time. He's also been a project manager and worked for a variety of large companies in the tech space. He earned his Bachelor of Engineering from ASU and Master's in Engineering Management from Duke. He's also been working on Nori and has released one of the first carbon removal marketplaces and paired it to a cryptocurrency. Very fascinated to hear a lot about Nori, some of the initiatives you're doing, and curious because Nori is a type of seaweed. And so the name and what you're evolving into is kind of what I'm really interested in hearing a little bit about. So with that, I'd like to introduce Paul.
Thanks, Elliot. All right, let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see that? Cool. Well, okay, thank you for having me. As Elliot said, I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Nori. We are a 15-person startup headquartered in Seattle. And as the slides that I'll walk through to kind of explain what Nori is. My background, I was, when it comes to seasteading, I got really interested in seasteading when I first heard about it, I think in like 2016 or so. And then in late 2017, I went to Tahiti with Greg and the Blue Frontiers team for one of the most fun weeks of my life. I don't know about you, Greg, but I still look back on that trip very, very fondly. So I've always been fascinated by this, have a very sort of free market oriented perspective on life. And that's really what we're trying to bring to the table here with Nori. So to jump in, we view climate change as a sort of straightforward problem that I think other people might. The problem is too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the solution is to pull those gases back out. And we need to pull out enough carbon dioxide in order to return the global atmospheric carbon concentration back to 300 parts per million. That starts by, of course, we have to, as a society, emit less, but we also are going to have to remove more carbon as well. And there are approaches that people have taken for this in the past. So carbon offsets are something you've probably heard of or maybe bought, but not all carbon offsets are exactly the same. So there are several different kinds, and it's important to distinguish what these are because their impact is really different. So the first kind of offsets are projects that reduce the amount of carbon going up into the air. So our example here is energy efficiency. There's less carbon emitting than would have happened otherwise, but there's still carbon going up. There are avoidances, which are projects that ultimately get rid of the source of emission, but are not necessarily doing anything about past emissions that are already up in the air. And that leaves us with removals. So carbon removals, we distinguish as something wholly different from carbon offsets, where they are actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it somehow, hopefully in some sort of useful way. So that's really the only way that we can actually reverse our emissions and go back to that 300 parts per million goal. The sad news is the vast majority of carbon offsets are reductions and avoidances. Very, very few of them are actually coming from carbon removal. So what's needed is we really need to increase the scale of carbon removal in order to remove 1.5 trillion tons from the air. And that's what Nori is. So we are a global transparent marketplace for carbon removal. We're focusing on transparency. So when you might have interacted with carbon offsets in the past, there's often an opaqueness about them. You don't necessarily know what it is that you're paying for or who's following up on them. That's really important to us to make that story very clear to people. Streamlined purchasing, because it is often very expensive. There are all sorts of middlemen and brokers involved in the current carbon offsets industry. It's not very accessible for consumers or smaller businesses. So you only really hear about like the big corporations that are doing this. Like fun story, one of the very large tech companies has a person who, she's like head of all carbon stuff for this gigantic corporation. She will literally spend 6 to 12 months out of her year doing diligence on a single carbon offset project, which is just utterly insane because of course no one but the giant corporations could afford that sort of thing. And then lastly, we are focused exclusively on carbon removal. We are not working with avoidances or reductions. There's not enough attention being put on removal, so that's why we focus on that. There are many different ways to remove carbon, from things like soil carbon capture and regenerative agriculture, forestry that everyone always thinks of, kelp and seaweed. So yes, Elliot, we named our company Nori because kelp is a really fantastic way to remove carbon, and more industrial approaches like direct air capture. We are ultimately agnostic to the different methods. We don't want to be choosing winners and losers. We want to let market forces determine what's the most efficient and effective means, but we do have to start somewhere. And so we chose to focus on regenerative agriculture because of the size and scale of this, to help prove the way so that as we build out a more robust marketplace, we can have additional methodologies supported. So there's massive amount of potential to store carbon dioxide in croplands around the world. there are a few different practices that you can do, including reducing the amount of tilling or plowing that you're doing, planting cover crops, and implementing more interesting complex crop rotations and more, like managed grazing. So what happens in soil is a mix of dirt and rocks and minerals and lots of organic matter like microbes and fungi. And when you're plowing soil at the beginning of the growing season, you're turning that over and you're exposing all the organic matter to the air where it dies off. And then you plant your crop, you put on fertilizer, and then you harvest your crop in the fall, and then you typically leave the field empty throughout the winter. Well, these regenerative practices are instead saying, don't plow the land, don't mix up that organic matter, leave it where it is. And then in the fall, plant cover crops, which is just saying you harvest your cash crop and you plant something else like rye or alfalfa, some low-lying thing. And what you're doing is keeping roots in the ground all the way around the year. And those roots are providing nutrients to the organic matter, the microbes and the fungi in the soil, who are in turn breaking down minerals and providing that back to the plants. That organic matter, the microbes and fungi, that is the carbon. So that's what we're trying to incentivize creation of here. This is our first farm project that we worked with. He's in Maryland. We've since worked with many others across the United States. We have partnerships with a bunch of large ag companies on source and supply for this. And we're working later this year to launch the cryptocurrency aspect that Elliot alluded to. So let me walk you through how this works exactly. So there are 4 different key stakeholder groups in the marketplace from a high level. So there are suppliers. These are people who are removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Today it's farmers. In the future, it'll be forest managers and kelp farmers and so on. There are third-party verifiers who are auditing the data that we get from suppliers to make sure that what they're telling us is accurate and true about the carbon. There's a carbon quantification tool, which is sort of a third party that we're relying on to interpret the data that we're getting from these projects and helping to quantify and determine what is the actual amount of carbon dioxide being removed from the atmosphere. And then lastly, our buyers, who are a mix of small and medium businesses, large corporations. Our biggest corporate sale to date has been to Shopify, and then consumers, and hopefully in the future, governments. So in our marketplace, we brand the carbon certificates. They're called NRTs, Nori Removal Ton. And this is how they're made. So first, farmers adopt the practices that pull carbon out of the air, and then they send project data to us. That data will include things like where their fields are located, what crops they're growing, what kind of fertilizer they used, when they irrigated. It's operating data on their land, so we know what's happening on the farm. That data is audited by a third-party verifier. There are about 50 verification companies around the world who do this work already for existing carbon markets, and we're just working with the same people. They're accredited to various ISO and ANSI standards. And what they're looking for are checking 3 major things. One, that the input data coming from the farmers is pretty accurate. So they might look at seed or fertilizer receipts or invoices to make sure that, yes, you bought corn seed in 2017 and then you planted corn. So that lines up with the data you reported. We're checking that they have the legal right to sell the carbon. The farmers are signing a 10-year contract with Nori that says they're going to keep that carbon in the ground. And it's the case that most farmers do not own their land in the US. And so we need to make sure that they've got permission from the landowner to actually uphold that 10-year obligation. And then we're also checking that we're not double counting and that this project isn't being listed anywhere else. So then that data gets sent to our carbon quantification tool. In this case, it's a platform that's called Soil Metrics, which is a private company spin out from Colorado State University, where they have a platform called Comet Farm. Now, Comet Farm has been funded by the US Department of Agriculture for like 20+ years. And the way that they work is they do rigorous soil sample testing around the United States, and then they layer on top of that different data models. And so we're able to avoid requiring individual farmers to do soil sampling on their land, which is prohibitively expensive and not really feasible, because the way to do soil sample testing is you have a control field and an experimental field right next to each other, and you take measurements in both fields, and you do that like multiple times a year over several years, and you're measuring the difference between the two, and that's how much carbon you're storing. It's not just like you measure in time 0 and then you measure in time 1 in the same field. That doesn't actually tell you how much carbon you're storing because carbon is constantly in flux in the soil. So this platform, Soil Metrics, is able to help us simulate what that is using modeling. And then lastly, the buyers purchase the NRTs from the suppliers, and then our revenue comes from a transaction fee that we charge the buyers. So one of the big problems in carbon markets today is that they're very much supply constrained. There is nowhere near enough supply. And so one of the ways to get rid of that barrier to entry is to not charge suppliers anything. So the suppliers only have to pay for third-party verification, which in this case is like $3,000 to $5,000. But we don't charge them anything. I mentioned that we have just this methodology. We are getting closer to the point, maybe later this year or next year, where we could start adding additional methodologies. So there are people working on kelp methodologies, which is how this relates to seasteading, where you could have a kelp farm as a part of your seastead. It's pretty easy to grow kelp, and it's actually somewhat straightforward for kelp. You just have to figure out the amount of mass that you've grown, and then you weight it and dump it and let it sink to the bottom of the ocean, and that should sequester the carbon for a really significant period of time. So that's like a really, really exciting potential future. It's why we named our company Nori. I don't have slides for the last bit, but when it comes to the cryptocurrency portion, one of the problems in existing carbon markets is double counting, or at least double crediting, like double of taking credit. So what happens normally is when a project developer does some sort of carbon offset project, they're issued carbon credits by an offset registry. These are our competitors. And that carbon credit is then typically sold to a broker who will then sell it on to someone else and someone else and someone else. So every time that carbon credit is being sold, it's getting marked up in price a little bit. So you have like rent-seeking behavior happening. And then in the end, like of the total amount of money that was paid, very little of it actually ends up in the hands of the project developer. And then there's also this concept of what's called retirement in carbon markets, where the end buyer can say, we're going to retire this credit. We're going to say it's no longer available for resale, and we're going to take final ownership. Well, probably less than 25% of all carbon credits ever end up actually being retired. So you can get a situation where you could have like a large oil company, for example, buying up many thousands of carbon credits, but then they hold them as an asset on their balance sheet. And then they could resell them if they wanted to. So they can get all the PR saying, hey, we've been buying carbon credits, but if they needed to, they could dump them for cash. And it's just a weird, stupid system. So in our market, instead, what happens is when the buyer purchases the NRT, it's immediately retired. It cannot be resold. And what we've done is we've separated out the certificate from the method of payment, where one Nori token, so there's a finite number of these, can be used to purchase one NRT. And the price of that token will fluctuate over time from supply and demand, and that will become the carbon price. And so we want a commodities market from this, but we want them trading the token rather than they're trading the carbon. And that should result in a situation where every dollar spent on carbon will actually result in net new carbon coming out of the air rather than pushing pieces of paper around. We haven't launched our token yet. We started by focusing on getting the carbon side of things working first, but the token launch is probably happening later this year, as that's a next major milestone for us. So I will leave it there and look forward to any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Paul. So a brief question from the supplier sense, I guess you could pretty much onboard any kind of supplier into that carbon removal marketplace. So why particularly focus on soil carbon as your first supplier, your first suppliers?
Mostly because it's the most affordable and the most scalable method of doing this today. And the entire food and agriculture industry is already pushing heavily in that direction. Like American croplands could sequester 400 million tons per year at maximum potential. Things like direct air capture, kelp, they're just nowhere near that level of scale. And then forestry takes a long time. You don't actually start seeing carbon sequestration until like 10 years into the life of that tree. So it just made like the most sense for business reasons to start there.
Okay, and then how does this kind of relate to the evolving carbon capture marketplace and sort of free market economics that we're talking about, the other speakers were talking about?
Well, one of the problems with carbon pricing is that no one actually knows what the real market price is, because we've got different situations where some companies have like an internal carbon price and that they're willing to pay. Some governments are announcing what they believe the carbon price should be. And oftentimes note that when they're talking about carbon price, they're talking about what should the tax be, like how much should it cost to emit a ton? Whereas we're trying to produce a market-driven value on 1 ton of removal, which is like sort of the other side of the same coin. No one knows what that is. And there are different government mandated markets, like California has a cap and trade market, and the EU has an ETS market. They basically don't actually reduce any emissions. And like the California cap and trade market is, I think, probably worse than doing nothing at all, because they end up creating a situation where the government has to create a price floor just to maintain any sort of trading on their carbon certificates, which in other ways, in a more pernicious way, acts as a price ceiling for voluntary offsets for some complex reasons I can explain if you want. But so all of these different efforts that have been made are not actually producing anything close to resembling real market value on what people and companies are looking for. And that's kind of our main objective here, is creating that market-driven price for carbon.
And so in terms of the current solutions that are ocean-based, what do you imagine needing to happen to quantify those ocean-based solutions that, like Greg talked about a little bit, as a means of then helping those get established on Nori's platform?
So part of it is like on us, like we have to do a better and just get to the point of evolving. Like we're still an early stage startup, but creating frameworks that people can write their own methodologies for measurement and verification. Like we have a scientific peer review process that we need these to go through, and then we want to get to the point very soon where others could be submitting methodologies to us, and then if it gets signed off on, then they could start selling NRTs through Nori. So like mangrove restoration and wetland stuff and kelp and all of that. And there are people working on these, but like for us as a company, part of the roadmap is just like, let's get the crypto trading and like, let's get the price established and then create that incentive and then go from there as we build this stuff out. It's infrastructure building.
Cool, cool. So I'm now gonna kind of kick off the discussion between Holly, Greg, and Paul. I'm pretty sure that Greg and Holly are chomping at the bit to kind of talk to each other a little bit. Yeah, some phenomenal ideas presented here. I think one of the key things that I'm really curious about, just prompting this discussion, what kind of systems do you really envision, do you imagine are better or worse when it comes to promoting positive change in these ocean-based solutions? What kind of challenges are there in implementing those? And kind of how does your work intersect? And so whoever wants to kind of kick off the discussion.
Well, I can certainly comment on Louisiana. And I think in terms of a lot of these ideas, maybe in this community, they're not so crazy revolutionary, particularly the floating community stuff. But to be in Louisiana and to be talking about some of these huge shifts, particularly away from the petrochemical industry and tourism, both of which are known entities, is very disruptive. It's very threatening. So I think that's where a lot of my work gets into community engagement and conversations about cultural preservation, cultural engagement, all those sorts of things. So there needs to be, I mentioned a little bit about changing this narrative. So really, it's creating the blue economy narrative here and convincing people that there's a real motivation, an economic motivation, and need, that there's the carrot of economic motivation, but there's the stick, that there is no plan B, that there is no future with what we're doing here. And Mardi Gras in 2021 demonstrated that. And what's happening with the petrochemical industry demonstrated that. So that shift is really scary and it creates pushback. And that's one of the big things. That's as much of our work here as anything related to building real wetlands and doing real projects and developing real technologies.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. What is the disincentive? We're talking about incentives in the marketplace, or we're talking about benefits that come from it, but what are the regulations or detriments, the demerits that come from the marketplace?
I think it's just a really important point that Greg is making that is hard for economics to really grapple with sometimes. And I think the approach that he's trying to take makes a lot of sense, at least in my mind, and that is trying to incorporate these individuals that are being impacted by some of these changes and give them some buy-in, give them some of the rights that will help them be innovative and entrepreneurial to help move these things forward. If we go back in history and we look at how we've created some of our national parks, we've dislocated millions and millions of people because we think that we should have this preservation, that we have this idea of what things should look like. And these people are suffering and then they have nothing. And that is also what causes a lot of the poaching and other stuff that goes on, or harvesting illegally, because they no longer have rights to be able to manage. Suddenly they have to steal or take from somebody else or from some common property because they don't have those property rights that are going to help them provide them with the right incentives and provide them with the potential for prosperity. So that's a real key. To come back to your question, Elliot, and think about what are some of the challenges, again, really thinking about the oceans and the landscape, or the oceanscape that we have, and what are the property rights there. We have the technology to be able to define those rights, but it's so hard to get agreement amongst different communities, different countries, different cultural ideas, and getting that set is really important for us to be able to manage properly. And again, from my perspective, we don't want some government to come out and say, this is how it should be managed. What we want is to have some clear property rights so that we can negotiate, so we can cooperate, so we can make those trades to move us towards those valued uses that society values, not just one particular form of governance or one particular political idea. And I'd like to bring that back to Paul. I've followed Nori a little bit over time. Actually, one of my former students works with the Nori, and I'm fascinated by what you guys are doing. And I'm so excited to get this sort of token price out there. I mean, that is the one area that I've actually seen. We might actually have a market price for some sort of carbon removal, or a real price rather than some price that people are just sort of making up. So I guess I want to push you a little bit more to share with us sort of, as you're trying to move towards getting into that cryptocurrency, how long is it going to take? What are the biggest hurdles that you have to actually sort of take that next step and get there?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. Okay, so there's the SEC, who just like are not good at dealing with new technology, and that has made it really difficult for American companies to deal with cryptocurrencies and launch them. I think that we've found ways to overcome a lot of those challenges. So our plan, our roadmap is, right now we're working on some scaling on the supply side software infrastructure of what we do. But then after that, we're going to most likely launch the token in a decentralized way on a decentralized, one of these like decentralized finance tools, probably using, if you know it, Balancer. And get initial liquidity going. And then we're going to start incorporating the token into the payment, because one of the things that we have to manage is when we're working with farmers, the farmers today, like technically we are consigning the NRTs from the farmer, and then we have to deliver their minimum floor price to them once it gets paid. So the farmers are all selling at $15 a ton, and we're just doing that with cash today. But then when the token starts trading, we need to slowly transition to have this being entirely token price driven. But if the token launch happens and it's only trading at, I don't know, $3 or something very low like that, then that's too low for the farmer to accept. It just wouldn't work. So what we'll probably do is, what we will do is we've set aside basically half of all of the tokens that we're creating, 250 million, to slowly distribute into circulation based on buyers purchasing these NRTs. So if the token's trading at $3, most buyers are paying cash anyway. So we'll have them pay $15, and then we'll deliver a token to the farmer that's worth $3, and then we'll deliver 12 of the dollars that the buyer paid in cash to the farmer, and then the farmer gets $15 of full value. And we'll keep doing that until we start seeing more of a normalization or like equilibrium reached between the token price and the price that the farmers are trying to get.
So just to kind of start diving in a little bit deeper, for a lot of these farmers that are selling on Nori's platform, quantifying that CO2, I mean, it's almost like additional money that they're making. How can you be sure that people aren't gaming the system? And that is kind of like a broader question to Greg and Holly. What are the different ways these economic systems can be gamed, that consolidation or monopolization could happen in these systems?
Well, for us, one thing people are worried about is, well, what if they just plowed their land, released all the carbon, and then they start sequestering carbon and get paid for that? Well, that's something that the verifier is checking. They have to, we actually have to collect land history going back to the year 2000 in order to make that soil metrics platform work. So we're able to get a good picture of what they were doing and ensuring that they're not cheating in that way. And that's just part of the verification process.
Sure. Yeah. So like, what are the third-party validation in these broader economic models that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I think in our case, it's a little bit more practical on the ground in terms of if we're growing biomass and creating barrier islands and wetlands, et cetera, that is something that it's either happening or it's not happening. It's fairly easy to measure and to see. There's the question of blue carbon, for me, it's such an important part of our work that I didn't even think to mention it, but I was very, very glad that Paul was able to give some context of that, because that you can see the economic potential of it, and everything that we're doing has a blue carbon implication to it. So I'm very excited to see what are these ways that we can create the verification for that component of it. We're actually talking to some large oil companies that basically they're moving forward with the concept of they don't start a project unless they know the full carbon footprint of it and they have a way to offset it. So we see that as a huge opportunity to not only develop the model for them, which they don't have to do the measurement, and then to offer them the offsets for that. And all of that is dependent upon verification. So we're talking to, I've certainly talked to Paul on different occasions. We're also talking to Regen Network, which I believe Paul is familiar with. And the land-based Regen Network, maybe a bit like Nori, is so far is more land-based focus in creating those models, creating those calculations. And the marine environment is still not completely understood in that respect as a developing industry in general. So we're very excited to see all of this verification and blue carbon markets and opportunities come to fruition. But having said that, we're not dependent on that. There's so many real things in the physical world of cities and wetlands, et cetera, that we can do. But the hope is that there will be layered benefit streams that will give additional economic incentives and global market incentives to support these sorts of regional scale ecosystem service projects.
I don't know that I have much to add to that, but I think that the projects that we're looking at are really sort of those cutting edge projects. And it's that innovation and new technology that helps us measure some of these things. And so that's not only important for some of the ideas that we're talking about here, but all of the ecosystem services that we look at on a global scale. It's really hard to measure those. So it's really hard to incorporate them into the marketplace. And it's these new technologies, it's these new ideas, it's the new understandings of how important and valuable they are that's helping us take those next steps to be able to incorporate those ideas into our marketplace and to get people willing to pay for them, right? These are all just ideas that we've been thinking about for a long time, that technology is enabling us to actually get some good metrics so that we can start to really think about how we can take the next steps to bring the market together to make these things happen.
Okay. Cool. I got some rapid fire questions before we open it up to the crowd. So the first for everybody, and we're going to go Paul, Greg, Holly. What is your favorite aquatic ecosystem for World Water Day?
Well, I live in the Pacific Northwest. I love being up here because of the seafood that we have available to us. I just adore salmon. It's like coming up soon, a couple months away, and it's like fresh salmon season. I look forward to it every year. My favorite time of year is when Alaska Airlines, the local airline here, they'll fly in the first salmon catch from the Copper River in Alaska, and it'll be like a big to-do. And so like the pilot will walk out of the plane like holding a fish over their head, and there'll be celebrity chefs on the tarmac grilling up salmon stuff. It's really fun. So yeah, I've lived here for 10 years, and this has become very near and dear to my heart.
Crawfish, shrimp, crab, it's all in the bayou. So when I do a lot of cooking down here. So gumbo, etouffee, shrimp creole, crawfish creole, all that. So the bayou, they call it the pantry down here. There's the theory of the Seven Nations theory of gumbo, that 7 nations contributed the different aspects, the smoked meats, the seafood, the okra. So the bayou brings it all together, the Caribbean, Native Americans, African Americans, French, Spanish, Germans, it comes all together. So the bayou, definitely for me.
I feel like I'm missing out on the Bayou Pantry for sure, because I live in Montana. We're a little landlocked, but I grew up in the Seattle area. And so I have to go along with Paul. We go out fishing in Craig, Alaska every couple of years to get some fresh salmon, fresh halibut. Can't be beat. You go to the store to purchase it. I'm sorry, it's just not the same after growing up on it. Yeah, we've got to go catch our own every now and then and just really enjoy it.
Fantastic. So what is a water related, seasteading related resource that isn't kind of conventional, that you constantly refer to, that you really enjoy talking about and sharing with other people? I'm thinking like books, movies, other things like that. And we can kind of have anybody jump in.
Well, while Paul's thinking, it's a little different. I mean, for me, to me, the resource is the enjoyment of it. So Louisiana is known as the sportsman's paradise. And everything we're talking about in terms of preserving the bayou and having a healthy Gulf and a vibrant seafood industry, sport fishing is huge down here, but also people enjoying the bayou for canoeing, kayaking, all sorts of things. So that the resource of enjoying this environment, I think, is a really important thing. That is, again, it's another not revenue stream, but benefit stream that is important to the economy as well as to the lifestyle and to people's ability to enjoy the aquatic environment.
As a chef, any particular cookbooks that you have in mind? Absolutely.
River Roads is the local Bible. It's done by the Junior League. It's been around for 100 years. I'll go grab it and show it to you, but it's basically put together by moms and daughters for the last 100 years, and it has all of the from the source recipes.
All right.
Go for it. Short answer. I grew up in Phoenix in Arizona in the desert. And so I would say there's nothing that like makes you appreciate water more than living in a place that doesn't have any of it. And so I moved here to Seattle 10 years ago. I never want to move away. It would be so hard for me to leave the water. I really like kayaking. They do like ski to sea competitions here where you start on the mountain, you're racing, and then you have to get to a river or other body of water and then get in your kayak or canoe and then continue racing. It's like a really unique sort of thing here because of the way our watershed works. And I just think it's like so cool.
So they call this the textbook of Louisiana cuisine.
I also posted a link, I think an Amazon link to the same book. So check it out there. Yeah.
Nice. I would answer that just with the innovation. I mean, seasteading is so amazingly innovative and entrepreneurial, and coming from a sort of a free market background, the ability to maybe test some different forms of governance at a small level, and see how things are working and how they expand as we get bigger and bigger groups. I just find it absolutely fascinating. And my son, actually, when I told him that I was going to be talking with you guys, he was like, "Oh my God, I'm so excited." He'd never heard of seasteading, and he's 22 years old, and one day he will probably come to you, Greg, and come travel with you a little bit and check it out, because he was super excited, and is now doing some research to figure it out a little bit more.
Cool. That's awesome. Any calls to action that all three of you have? Anything that people can do to engage, get involved, help out with your initiatives?
Yeah, the big thing for me is the Clean Tech Open. So again, Clean Tech Open has been around for about 15 years, has helped early stage clean tech companies raise over $1.5 billion. And we're trying to get a good cohort started in New Orleans. So if you are part of a clean tech, or particularly water related, because we want to give it a blue tech spin, an early stage blue tech or clean tech company in the New Orleans, Texas, Mississippi, so South Central region, please reach out to me or go to the Clean Tech Open. And they're a wonderful program, nonprofit, very low cost, but based on the lean startup model and doing outstanding work.
I just like to say sharing information and knowledge with other people. I think there's not a lot of people that understand what seasteading is and how important it is, and some of the innovations that we have here. And same with the markets and the ideas that we work with at PERC. People don't understand how markets can actually help resolve some environmental problems, and how political environmentalism might actually take us in the wrong direction sometimes. And I think bottom line of that is when we're looking at developing countries, and some of the policies that we're getting proposed and policies that are actually taking place are going to make people poorer. And when we make people poorer, we're going to have more environmental problems. We actually know that environmental quality is increased when we have increased prosperity. So we want to make sure that we're helping continue that growth in prosperity on a global scale, so that we can continue seeing environmental quality and better environmental outcomes. And most people don't understand that. I think that's really important for us all to share and just keep those ideas in mind. And of course, make sure that if you're interested, you take a look at PERC and what we do, and have a conversation with us.
For us, we have a weekly podcast that we host called Reversing Climate Change. And I'm going to put a link in the chat here with, there's a guy named Brian von Hertzen who runs the Climate Institute, which is all about kelp and carbon sequestration with kelp. And so I would suggest listening to that, learn more about how kelp can be part of the carbon solution.
Cool, great. I want to now thank all of our speakers. What I really like doing in Zoom is, for applause, you just write gibberish in the chat. That's a good way of applauding. So anybody can write gibberish in the chat. That's a really good way to do it. Or you have the applause reaction emojis and stuff like that. Good job, Ed. That was really funny. I like that. And so big thank you to all of our speakers. We now have a good, we blocked off about 2 hours of time. If the speakers are still available, they can potentially hang around and talk a little bit more to people in the chat, answer some additional questions. But this is kind of the end of the structured time of this conversation. I can still sort of moderate a little bit of different questions that come up in the chat. But I think, yeah, big thank you to all our speakers. Help support a number of initiatives for World Water Day and seasteading. And with that, kind of open it up to general discussion.
I said I can open. I had a question in general for the panelists, or others might have an idea, especially you, since you're in the business. That is food production considered carbon capture or not? It was kind of briefly mentioned in the chat even, because it does eventually find its way back in the atmosphere, you know, after the food is digested and excreted. But so, yeah, it's kind of like, how long does it have to be sequestered to be considered sequestration?
So food and agriculture as an industry worldwide accounts for up to maybe 20% of carbon emissions. It's a huge net emitter. It is not at all a sequestration source on its own, unless you change to those practices that I was describing. And you're not really, the carbon is not in the plant itself, it's in the stuff that's in the soil. And the reason that it's such a huge source of emissions is because of, you've probably heard the term soil erosion. And that's what happens when you're turning over the soil and you're exposing the organic matter, and the organic matter is dying off. And you're getting, when I had that picture of the two different soil types up there, the one that was like really light brown and looked kind of like clay, that's from soil erosion. So food production is a huge source of emissions, but it could become a sink if more farmers adopted these practices and were incentivized to do so.
Right. For instance, with kelp or seaweed, that you're producing biomass that contains the carbon, you're absorbing biomass from the air, so there's a net sink. Would that be considered sequestration because eventually it's eaten, or not?
Maybe Elliot has a good answer to this question too, from his company, but for our purposes, what it would have to be kelp that was not utilized for some industrial or food use. It would have to be sunk to the bottom of the ocean and locking up that carbon.
Yeah, it's challenging to approach it from a food sense, especially if it's for like human consumption. The general assumption is that your body retains some of that carbon, and so the shelf life of that carbon is about human lifespan. But in essence, you do pass a lot of waste through your system, and any excess material does get metabolized and passed through your system. And so food is not currently counted as a carbon sequestration methodology. There are ways of quantifying carbon reduction, particularly methodologies of feeding cows. There's really like a famous couple papers of feeding cows algae to kind of reduce the amount of methane production in their stomachs. And so that's a carbon offset, not necessarily, basically carbon remediation. It's not carbon remediation, it's carbon offset. It's kind of like shifting the carbon production and methane production in a certain kind of way. But yeah, in general, food does not really sequester carbon. One of the main emitters in the agricultural system is the production of nitrogen. And the production of nitrogen, particularly through the Haber-Bosch process, which produces roughly like just that one chemical equation to produce ammonia that goes on soil and fields and then washes into ocean waters. That produces about 4% of total carbon emissions through that one chemical equation. So yeah, when we talk about soil carbon, it's oftentimes the nitrogen cycle in the soil, not necessarily that in conjunction to the carbon cycle in the soil. So yeah. Yeah, and yes, methane is much worse than carbon. I think it's 23 times the amount. Paul, somebody could probably, yeah, thereabouts.
Yeah, roughly.
Okay, and how about like building materials? You mentioned industrial processes, like a feedstock wouldn't count either, but if you're sequestering it, say a cellulose that's used in building or a plastic, would that be considered sequestered or not?
Mm-hmm.
There's actually some great work done by Corum. I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly what that stands for, but it's CORRIM. And they have done life cycle analysis on building products and really looked at the sequestration within timber products and wood products, even when you're sort of remanufacturing those products, and compared using those timber products to fossil fuel intensive products such as steel and brick and cement. And there really is some huge benefit in using timber as a building product. And if you actually think about the sequestration in the forest, as that tree is growing, as it has that fast, rapid growth, it's sequestering more carbon. Then when you cut that tree, it maintains a good portion of that carbon as you use it as a building product, and you can grow more trees and you can increase sequestration that way. Versus if you look at sort of doing a carbon credit where we're not allowing people to cut that forest, as that forest gets older, it'll maintain that carbon in there, but it'll slow down how much it sequesters. And as a result of that, we're going to get less sequestration there. And potentially if you're setting enough aside, forestry aside, that you're not cutting it, then you're using alternative building products that are more fossil fuel intensive. So there is some analysis that's out there that demonstrates that yes, building products matter a lot, and some of these big wood buildings and doing some of the CLT and some of these other manufacturing products can really help us sequester more carbon.
And then if you get a forest fire, all the carbon goes up as well.
That's right.
Yeah, seaweed doesn't catch on fire, which is one of the benefits. Or it's very hard for it to catch on fire.
Elliot,
Joe.
I have a question. How are you? I'd like to ask your presenters, first acquaint them with the fact that we are growing very special biocrops that actually absorb nearly 4 times as much CO2 per acre as forest land. And then we have them simultaneously doing other types of beneficial environmental services, like extracting large amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus from watershed farmland, Chesapeake Bay watershed in particular, Western Ohio. And we've been selected by the Exelon Foundation's Climate Change Investment Initiative to do a project in Baltimore where we'll treat brownfield sites, and we will be developing essentially a vertical farm to be able to extract flue gas from large emitters like power plants and industrial firms. So my question is, our sequestration effort involves making bio-based alternatives to carbon black, which is a filler powder. So we can sequester our carbon in plastics and composites and even in tires. And also we make a biochar soil amendment, which also allows us to sequester that carbon in soil. So Paul, in particular, does this kind of activity qualify for NORI's programs or other programs that were being discussed today as incentives?
Maybe in the future. We actually get approached by a lot of people who are interested in different types of soil amendments or different types of seeds. Like we're partnered with a company called Locus Ag, who has their product called the Rhizolizer, which they believe sequesters more carbon as well. We don't have a good, reliable way of at scale and affordably measuring that actual difference. Like it's not incorporated into that carbon quantification tool. So that's something that we will be figuring out in the years to come, but not as of right now, because we're just starting with like the most simple base case first and then scaling up from there.
So
I would just say real quick, Joe, for us in Louisiana, basically when I'm looking at opportunities, I'm looking at does it grow or attract talent to the area? So in the form, maybe with new entrepreneurs, et cetera, how does it impact the local economy? Does it grow that blue economy and create something new and interesting here? And then obviously, does it have a positive environmental impact? So if you're interested in developing prototypes here or getting pilot projects going and doing something that sort of starts to engage in the local blue economy here while having these other benefit streams, then that's the sort of thing we're interested in.
Good, thank you.
Mike had a really interesting question in regards to OPEC and how OTEC kind of generates energy, brings deep water up and feeds an entire food chain, creates more sea life. And so, Mike, do you want to kind of expand upon that? I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Oh, okay, sure. It kind of touches on before we were talking about how things are migratory in the ocean, fish, and even algae. So if you have a process, say an OTEC plant, and you have artificial upwelling, and you're creating a whole food chain, it creates an algae bloom that feeds krill and fish, and you'd like to lay claim to all of that product with property rights. And so I was wondering with Holly, what she was describing, how would you like allocate that kind of a property right? Quantify it, say who has the right to fish or capture the results from that upwelling.
You know, that's a great question. If we don't have some sort of a property right over that particular region, it becomes sort of a commons. And so then you would have sort of access for all or open access. Can you actually start to create some of those property rights? And when do property rights sort of evolve so that we have better defined property rights? And those property rights evolve over time as the benefit of sort of capturing that right outweighs the cost of capturing that right. And so again, I think we're sort of at the cutting edge of a lot of this stuff, thinking about, well, are there benefits to actually start defining some of these rights? And in many cases there are. I don't know much about OTEC, so I can't sort of say sort of where we sit with that one. But nonetheless, if there are these benefits that exist out there, and we're providing this additional food and this additional habitat, we could imagine in a future world that there would be some ability to create some property rights on it. Again, when we come down to property rights that are really in open access, the air, it's, you know, carbon is a property rights issue, but I don't, you know, we can't define our little piece of air, so we have to define it differently. And so we become very innovative. And how are we going to define it, right? How are we sequestering things? How are we emitting things? Is there some way that we can get people to behave according to those incentives? So if you're trying to motivate sort of this OTEC plant and other things, we might need to think a little carefully about what are the benefits, who's actually receiving those benefits, and can we get them to help pay for that? And you know, that is nearly impossible in some areas and not so hard in others. And one example, come back to that wildfire issue, you know, we're trying to do forest restoration on our public lands that are an absolute mess. We don't have funding to do that. We have all sorts of other complications with the federal government taking care of their landscape, but we actually have people in the private sector now that are saying, you know what? It matters. We need to do this restoration. We have insurance companies that are helping pay for it. We have water utilities that are helping pay for it. We have local people that are worried about their homes burning down that are helping to pay for this. So something that we used to think was sort of this, you know, problem that we had all these free riders or all these people that were subject to it, but we couldn't sort of enforce one person to pay for it. As we start to understand those problems more and the information is better, and we start to realize those benefits we can receive, we do start to get more and more people willing to pay for it and help ensure that we're getting this better environmental quality and better outcomes.
Yeah, and I would just comment, Mike, you probably know this, that particularly in equatorial regions, and we discovered this in French Polynesia, that the OTEC in relation to air conditioning is really important. So air conditioning, particularly with the heat waves, you know, that we're looking at areas, I don't know the statistics, but we're looking at more and more areas of the earth that for hours or days at a time will be uninhabitable by human beings because of the heat that we're going to be seeing in the coming decades. But the many more deaths happen because of lack of air conditioning than because of freezing. And this is going to be more and more of a problem. So OTEC in equatorial regions and the energy saved, that because we don't have to convert electricity to air conditioning, we can use direct cooling. That to me is a particularly important thing. And again, another parallel important benefit stream that goes along within the other components that you mentioned, Mike.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
I'm going to kick it over to John, who's had his hand raised quite patiently.
Yeah, just ask the question. Let's say we successfully incentivize people to remove carbon from the atmosphere really, really successfully to the point where the carbon levels actually start going down. Is there any kind of systems in place to ensure that when the carbon levels get to, I don't know, 300 parts per million or 280 parts per million, that the incentives start to kick off and that we don't undershoot and enter into an ice age?
I think
That's the whole.
You can just burn more fossil fuels then. Like, we know that's the easy part. Like, we know how to make the carbon go up. It's the hard part is pulling it out. I would suggest that probably, I mean, like let's say Nori is successful, like at a global scale in the way that we want to be, which would mean that the price of carbon is reflected in the value of our token. And if we were successful in seeing the world return to 300 parts per million, I would imagine the value of that token would plummet. And people wouldn't want it anymore because there wouldn't be as much value in pulling carbon out of the air. And then you would have suppliers reacting to that, responding to that. So supply of removal would slow down, which would then hopefully reach some sort of equilibrium. But that's like decades away. I'm not too worried about that particular problem.
Yeah, I think carbon emission is also geopolitical. Like when you take a look at the countries that are actually benefiting from climate change, you have Canada and Russia in particular having longer growing cycles and opening up of Arctic regions. And so it's almost like having too much carbon in the atmosphere, having too little carbon in the atmosphere, I don't think is going to be a major problem for quite some time. And if it is, then we're in a really good situation.
I have to just emphasize Paul's point there, because if we really have markets that are functioning here for us, it's the market price that's going to direct whether we're taking more out of the air or not, right? And we don't have to have some stopgate where we say, oh, we've got to change the political idea or the policy or the regulation, because the markets are able to take care of that. And that is one of the huge benefits of markets. Now, of course, we've also talked about the fact that this is a really difficult thing to put into the marketplace. So there are certainly challenges.
Any additional questions from the audience, or any questions that the panelists have for each other?
Well, I'll make a comment, and it's a bit directed towards Holly. That what I was hearing, and something that I think about is that, and related to seasteading, I really see global government systems that are based on scarcity of resources, just as you can argue that right now global government and global policies are very much based on fossil fuels, that we're going to be, when the scarcest commodities become clean water and clean air, that we're going to be moving more and more towards a globally based government that is regulating and controlling those resources. So Holly touched on ideas of transparency, and Paul's working on ways of making these things measurable and all that. So I just think that this is what the future is going to be, and the transparency component, and hopefully, you know, when we talk about the blue economy and what we're doing on the projects in the Gulf and all that, we want to be working, fundamentally, we're talking about open source technologies and fully transparent systems that may or may not be on the blockchain, et cetera. But the transparency is really critical, because just because a global government is environmentally based rather than petrochemically based or gold based or whatever have you, does not mean that it will be a more benevolent government. It can be as draconian and as bad behaving as we see many governments right now. So the difference hopefully will be the transparency, and hopefully the technologies that Paul's developing and the conversations about the free market, the FME, is going to be part of that global political system.
I said a global political system scares me, not just a little bit, for sure. And so I think, again, one of the things that we're really trying to push for at PERC and get people to understand better is the importance of those markets functioning within there. There is a role for government helping us define those property rights, helping ensure those property rights, both to ourselves as individuals and to the resources and assets and land that we have, is really important. But trying to keep that fairly limited is also really important, because those markets that allow for the changing dynamics, allow for us to understand the changing information, the scarcity issues that occur. And again, it's not the resource, each individual resource that we want, it's what it does for us, right? And what the markets do for us is allow us, when the price of oil and gas gets really high, we start to shift into other things. We start to conserve, we start to find alternatives. That is a response that we don't tend to get from a political system. So when we look at that market, we get this cooperative, let's trade, let's make these negotiations outcome, versus the political system that really tends to be winner takes all. I get to decide and you get it and you don't, right? And this is how it's going to be used. And suddenly we've lost all that ability to be really innovative. So we really need to make sure that we continue to share those ideas, and that we do have that transparency, and to try to get those clear property rights so that we can continue to see those trades and those cooperative approaches.
Fantastic. Any other closing statements, Paul, Greg, Holly, anything like that before we all break?
Please reach out to us. Follow us on Instagram. We're PERC_conserves. Follow us on at PERC tweets. Look at us on the website. Send me an email. We'd love to continue the conversation, and would love to try to help share the ideas with more people. And thank you so much. This has been fun.
Yeah. I appreciate the comments and the questions. A couple of you have already reached out, so look forward to following up. And again, wonderful to be back in the seasteading community, and to see Paul and get to know Holly. And so this has been an exciting opportunity, and looking forward to staying in touch.
Yep, thanks for having us.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. This recording will also be up online and shared with the broader seasteading community. So if you're interested in other seasteading socials, there is somewhere in the chat a survey about the different kind of things that we can do in the future, and be sure to attend our next one, I think next month. And so thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and happy World Water Day.
Thank you.
Thanks.